On April 10th, 1912, one of the largest and most luxurious ships ever built began its first voyage. It was called the RMS Titanic. At the time, it was considered a technological marvel, a symbol of human ambition, a ship so enormous and advanced that many believed it was almost impossible to sink. But just 4 days into its journey, everything changed. On a freezing night in the North Atlantic, the Titanic struck an iceberg. In less than 3 hours, the ship would disappear beneath the ocean. More than 1,500 people would lose their lives, and the world would be left with one haunting question. How could a ship considered so extraordinary become one of the greatest maritime disasters in history? This is the story of the Titanic. In the early 20th century, the world was changing rapidly. Technology was advancing, cities were growing, and ocean liners had become symbols of wealth, power, and progress. Among the companies competing for dominance was the British shipping company White Star Line. The company wanted to build ships that would be larger, more luxurious, and more comfortable than anything the world had seen before. One of those ships was the Titanic. Construction began in Belfast, Ireland, in 1909. Thousands of workers spent years building the enormous vessel. The finished ship was more than 880 feet long. It had luxurious dining rooms, grand staircases, swimming facilities, and elegant cabins. For wealthy passengers, traveling on the Titanic was not simply transportation. It was an experience. And on April 10th, 1912, the ship began its maiden voyage. The Titanic departed from Southampton, England. It would travel across the Atlantic, stopping at Cherbourg in France and Queenstown in Ireland before continuing toward New York. On board were more than 2,200 passengers and crew members. They came from very different backgrounds. There were wealthy businessmen traveling in luxurious first-class cabins. There were families hoping to start a new life in America. And there were hundreds of crew members responsible for keeping the enormous ship running. For many passengers, the voyage seemed almost perfect. The ship was comfortable. The food was impressive. The ocean was calm. And the Titanic moved steadily through the Atlantic. But beneath the surface of this peaceful journey, danger was approaching. The Titanic was entering an area where icebergs had been reported, and several warnings were received. On April 14th, the Titanic received multiple wireless messages warning of ice in the ship's path. These warnings were not all treated in the same way. Some were passed to the bridge. Others were handled as routine communications. At the time, wireless operators were extremely busy sending personal messages for passengers. The Titanic was also traveling at a relatively high speed. The crew had no modern radar. There were no satellite navigation systems, and the lookouts depended mainly on their own eyesight. Then, shortly before midnight, the lookouts saw something ahead. An iceberg. The warning was given. The ship began to turn, but the distance was too short. The Titanic struck the iceberg. The collision did not create one enormous hole in the side of the ship. Instead, the impact damaged several sections of the hull. Water began entering the ship. At first, many passengers did not realize the seriousness of what had happened. But the crew soon discovered the truth. The Titanic was sinking. The Titanic had been designed with watertight compartments. This system was supposed to help protect the ship if part of it flooded. But there was a critical problem. Too many compartments had been damaged. Water began moving from one section to another. The ship's designers had created a vessel that could survive a limited amount of flooding. But this damage was beyond that limit. As the bow of the Titanic slowly sank lower into the ocean, the crew prepared the lifeboats. And now another problem became clear. There were not enough lifeboat spaces for everyone on board. The Titanic carried lifeboats capable of holding only a portion of the people aboard. This was legal under the regulations of the time. But in a real emergency, the consequences would be devastating. Passengers were told to put on life jackets. Some people still did not understand how serious the situation was. Others were reluctant to leave the enormous ship. After all, the Titanic was considered one of the safest ships in the world. Many people believed that help would arrive quickly, but the ocean was enormous, and the nearest rescue ship was still far away. The first lifeboats began leaving the Titanic, but many were launched without being completely full. This happened for several reasons. Some passengers did not want to leave the ship. Others believed the Titanic was safer than the small lifeboats floating in the freezing ocean. There was also confusion during the evacuation. The crew had to make difficult decisions about who would enter the lifeboats first. The famous phrase, "women and children first," was followed in many areas, although the exact procedure varied. Meanwhile, distress signals were being sent into the night. The Titanic's wireless operators were desperately calling for help. One nearby ship, the RMS Carpathia, received the messages and began racing toward the Titanic. But the Carpathia was still hours away, and time was running out. As the Titanic sank deeper into the Atlantic, the situation became increasingly desperate. Around 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface. The ship had been sinking for less than 3 hours. The ocean around the wreck was dark and freezing. Hundreds of people were left in lifeboats. Many others were in the water. The RMS Carpathia eventually arrived and began rescuing survivors. By the time daylight appeared, the Titanic was gone. News of the disaster spread around the world. The Titanic had been described as a masterpiece of engineering. Now it had become a symbol of tragedy. More than 1,500 people had died. Only around 700 survived. The disaster shocked the world, and questions immediately began to emerge. Why had the ship been traveling so quickly through an area known to contain ice? Why were there not enough lifeboats for everyone? Why were some lifeboats launched before they were full? And could the disaster have been prevented? For decades, the wreck of the Titanic remained hidden beneath the Atlantic. Then, in 1985, a joint American-French expedition located the shipwreck. The Titanic had been found. Deep beneath the ocean, the remains of the famous ship rested in darkness. The discovery allowed researchers to study the wreck and learn more about what happened that night. Over the years, new technology and scientific research have helped historians understand the disaster in greater detail. The Titanic was not simply destroyed by one mistake. Its sinking was the result of multiple factors: the speed of the ship, the presence of ice, the limitations of early 20th century technology, the shortage of lifeboats, and a series of decisions made during the emergency. Together, these factors created a disaster that changed maritime history forever. More than a century has passed since the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic. Yet, the story still fascinates millions of people around the world. Perhaps it is because the Titanic represents something bigger than a shipwreck. It represents human ambition, the desire to build something greater, something faster, something that seems almost impossible to destroy. But the Titanic also reminds us of an important lesson. Technology can be powerful. Engineering can be extraordinary. But nature remains unpredictable. And even the greatest achievements of humanity can be vulnerable. Today, the Titanic rests thousands of meters beneath the ocean, slowly disappearing into the deep. But its story has never disappeared. It remains one of the most famous tragedies in history. A story of ambition, a story of tragedy, and a story that continues to raise questions more than a century later. The Titanic was called a ship that could never sink. But on one cold April night, the ocean proved otherwise. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's greatest mysteries, subscribe to The Hidden Chapters. Here, we uncover the stories behind the events that shaped our world. Because history is full of hidden chapters, and some of them are still waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to The Hidden Chapters and uncover the past with us.